Hello everyone. My name is Nihar and welcome to Learn and Grow. In this session, we will learn domain-driven design and how it is relevant to microservice architecture. If you want to learn more detail about microservice architecture, please refer my earlier video. I have given the link in the description. Thank you. Domain-driven design. Now, this is there for quite some time now. And this is just a design approach which use decomposition of requirement based on domain or business functionality. Now, decomposition is the key here, and we would keep hearing about it every now and then. It helps us to analyze the architecture with decomposed self-contained unit, defining the responsibility of each unit and the relationship between them. Now, let's go through some of the basic of domain-driven design. Before we go detail into domain-driven design, let's quickly discuss about microservice architecture, because that's where we land eventually, right? Microservice is an architectural style that helps in developing scalable and distributed software. In this era, we are all looking at distributed system or distributed application, which would be addressed to a larger audience across the globe, right? With this style, what we get is we've broken the application into smaller business or domain modules. Each module can be developed and deployed independently. And since they are independent, development team can work autonomously without stepping into each other's door. Those are the benefits of microservice architecture. There are two key considerations in microservice architecture. One of them is modularization, and the second is scalability. In modularization helps with finding out smaller module or component, whereas scalability helps us to deploying those smaller module in a horizontal way or in a horizontal cluster for achieving the scalability. Now, these two are interrelated with domain-driven design. Let's see how they are interrelated, right? But before that, as we discussed, let's go a little bit deeper into domain-driven design and the key component behind them. The very first, as the name suggests, domain. Now, what's domain all about, right? This is what the organization does, which means if my organization is dealing with the banking system, it could be a banking domain. If it is maybe insurance sector, insurance domain, retail domain, healthcare domain. So the core business of an organization is defined as domain. Now, the second one is the subdomain. Now, this is where we start breaking it down. How a subdomain how can we define a subdomain is basically an organization or a business unit within the organization. Now, it could be a banking or a financial domain, would have a payment domain or a card domain or billing domain. So those are the smaller component within the larger domain, right? And that's where we go a little bit more precise into the requirement. Now we talk about domain and subdomain. Now this entire domain-driven design is driven by a group of people like the developers, the product manager, the domain expert, the business stakeholder, and all of them. But then everybody needs to understand one common language to build the narrative, and that's ubiquitous language. The next one is very important. That's the bounded context. Bounded context is defined as a setting in which a word or a statement appears to be determining its meaning. Very textual. Let's look into the more practical way. It's, in short, what we are looking at is a boundary within which a model makes sense. Now, if I'm talking about an item, right? Item has a different meaning when it is in cart, when it is in the order, when it is in the inventory, when it is in the warehouse. So every different context will change the definition of a model or properties of the model. And this is very critical because we need to understand what exactly we are dealing with and what kind of functionality we can associate with that. Now, so far we talked about domain, subdomain, bounded context, how they related to each other. And that's where it defines in context map. It precisely defines the relationship between bounded context or the smaller component within this. Now, this is how a domain-driven design works, right? I have my main requirement. I broke it. I identified my domain. I identified my subdomain. I created my bounded context and the relationship between them. Now, let's go a little bit more deeper into it, right? What exactly it does. So as I said, the developer, the domain expert, the business stakeholder, or the business analyst, everybody works on a planning session or a workshop. They work on it. They create within the session. There will be output to that. It could be a product specification or a bunch of stories within the backlog, which in turns create a functional specification and it could be a code as well. Now, this is how we boil down in a domain-driven design. Now, let's look it into a different perspective, right? Let's take an example of credit card domain. Now, it could be a finance domain or banking domain, but let's consider this as a main domain, credit card, right? It's quite big. Now, within the credit card domain, we'll have the origination where the card would be, the loan or application would be created, the servicing part of it, the managing the card, then the fraud. At any point in time, we'll check the fraud part of it, the payment where we get the payment out of it, or we will make the customer will use the card. Now, all these things are subdomain. Now, each subdomain can have one or more bounded context or key responsibility. For example, payment domain can have a payment context, a billing context. Now, payment context can even go smaller component into it. The origination context can have like getting the QII information, validating them, going through the application process, or servicing can basically take care of all the billing part, however we take it, right? There could be a cross-cutting context as well. Now, this is basically a high-level overview how we can break it down. Now, since we talk about bounded context as one of the smallest component, does that mean that is equivalent to a microservice? Possibly yes, or it could be more smaller component, could be a microservice. Let's look into it a little bit on other side of it. So we talk about two context, right? Origination and payment. Let's talk about how this context are interrelated and how they communicate with each other. We talk about origination and payment. They are interrelated and they communicate with each other. How they do that? They do that with context map. Context map is nothing but a relationship between two bounded context. Now, the relationship could be of multiple type. For example, partnership, shared kernel, customer supplier, conformist, or anti-corruption layer. These are the key one. By large, they two bounded context can have some partnership within them, or they can in fact shared a particular responsibility, create a adapter in front of it. There could be multiple way, but this is how they work together, right? Let's look into it a little bit on other side of it. Origination as a bounded context can have smaller component in it. For example, application information, credit check, application approval. Payment context can have a loan approval, loan account, payment detail. Now, these are the smaller component inside this. A bounded context can have one or multiple smaller component. Now, this smaller component are truly eligible for a microservice, right? Because they take care of individual responsibility. Let's see how they are connected. Now, once we translate them to a microservice, they need to interact with each other. Now, how microservice interact with each other, that's purely depends on a different architecture, need of the architecture, right? It could be message driven, choreography, or event driven, one or other way, right? In this scenario, I have just taken event driven architecture, created a service bus. I can have application info, credit check, application approval, and all of them are smaller microservices. They communicate with each other with their event, and it proceed with the next step. Now, so far we have discussed about domain-driven design and boiling down to a microservice, right? We created a domain, we've identified the domain, we identified the subdomain, we created the bounded context, we created a context map. Within bounded context, we have smaller component, and then we map them to individual microservice. See, this is how the journey starts from domain-driven design and end in microservice. Thank you all for watching this. Hope you like it. If you like it, share and subscribe. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.